let me introduce Jeff Winchester, and he'll come on up, and we're going to talk about the State of California Water Project. Let's give Jeff a big hand.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Didn't know quite what to expect tonight, but I think since this is a smaller group, if it's all right with you, we'll keep it a little informal in that if you have something to say or a question to ask me while we're discussing some of the water issues that I'm going to talk about. And primarily, we're going to keep it real simple. We're going to talk about water in general. We're going to talk about California water, a little bit about the drought and how we get floods during El Nino seasons, because it looks like we're going to have a pretty good El Nino this year. So we're going to talk about quite a few little things along the way, but primarily the main focus is going to be on the State Water Project. A little bit about myself. I have worked for the Department of Water Resources since December of 2007. I was in water operations, and I did work on the aqueduct from Pear Blossom over through Lake Silverwood. I was stationed out of the Devil Canyon Power Plant, and so I also worked on the Santa Ana Valley Pipeline that carries water on down to Riverside, as well as on the East Branch Extension, which we have a 54-inch pipe that heads out towards Yucca Valley, where did I get that one from? Now I'm lost. Which heads out towards Yucaipa and on towards Cherry Valley. So I was told at one time that the plan was to try and return some water down to the Salton Sea, but I think in today's times of drought and conservation, that those plans have been put on the back burner for quite some time. Prior to working with the state of California, I also worked for 13 years with the city of Los Angeles in wastewater collection systems. And I was a training instructor for the wastewater collection system division, primarily though with safety issues, traffic and confined space and the like. So with that, just real briefly, before we start getting into too much about, like I said, we're going to take some baby steps here. I was expecting a little bit larger group, and so like I say, I kind of had some things in mind, and so I'm going to stick to a little bit of a plan in that. Scientists believe that of all the water that's on the planet, we only can use about 2% of it. And the reason why is because it's either too salty or it's in a form we can't use, such as ice or liquid steam, evaporation, that sort of thing. So we can't utilize it. So that means we don't have much to work with to begin with. And that the same water that you see today in the form of rainfall or coming through your pipelines at the house or work, it's the same water that's been here on the planet since day one. It doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps recycling and recycling. And so I think that's a pretty neat concept when you think about it, and yet we still have problems utilizing it sometimes. Right now, for instance, we've been in a drought for 4 years, and we have cities such as Porterville that literally they're using tanks in their front yard that were placed there by the city to get water from because the wells have dried up. The water table is gone. And I think most of us in this room are at least old enough to have heard, if not to experience, some of the things that have happened in the Central Valley over the years with what happens when you pump too much groundwater. You get subsidence. So like I said, we're going to mention these things along the way before we start talking too much about California's water. With that, if you would please, I'd like to start with the other one, though, I believe, if that's all right. Just a little background history with California water. It's a DVD that, I should also tell you right now, I am a guide too at Pyramid Lake Vista del Lago Water Education Center, and Mr. Leafdale actually was asked me to come by and speak and talk about the State Water Project, and so I agreed to do that. And one of the DVDs that we do show does talk about California's water history, and so with that, I'd like to show that film. No, yeah, no problem. I'm trying to stall for you, too. Like I say, this is the first time we've put together this presentation, so there might be a few bugs we have to iron out as we go along. This is the one, and then it should be the first one that comes up, I believe. California water history. The California water story. There you go. Please.
You get the first.
The story of California water use began a long time ago, long before we had swimming pools and hot showers, before we had cities and processing plants and acres of orchards. Hundreds of years ago, small tribes of Indians were scattered across the land. These native Californians had to live close to a water source to survive. Planting and irrigating crops was done on a limited basis. Europeans came to California in 1542, but it wasn't until the late 1700s that they began moving water great distances. Spanish missionaries built a 6-mile irrigation ditch from the San Diego River to the San Diego Mission. Other missions in California soon began to irrigate their lands, too. Rancheros, settlers, and farmers followed. They diverted streams, dug wells, and built dams to maintain water supplies during the dry season. In 1849, waves of gold miners poured into California. Flumes, water wheels, and aqueducts were soon scattered throughout the Sierra Nevada foothills. For a short time, the roar of hydraulic mining echoed across canyons, washing away entire mountainsides. Silt and debris were carried downstream, filling in river channels and causing more frequent flooding of valley lands. Farmers in the valleys had levees built to protect their lands, but the silting and the floods continued. Farmers and communities along the rivers were angry. They took the miners to court. 1884. The dumping of debris into streams and rivers was prohibited. For most hydraulic mining operations, it was the end of an era. California has always had cycles of wet years followed by years of drought. In the 1870s, a severe drought caused the death of thousands of sheep and cattle in Southern California and forced many ranchers out of business. In the early 1900s, another drought and a growing population spurred the city of Los Angeles to look outside of its basin and buy land and water rights in the Owens Valley, 250 miles away. Built amid controversy and violence, the Los Angeles Aqueduct is designed to carry water from the Owens Valley to the city of Los Angeles. Southern California continued to prosper, and they needed more water. In the 1930s, work began on the Colorado River Aqueduct, which brings water to much of Southern California, from the Los Angeles Basin to San Diego. Construction also began in the 1930s on the All-American Canal. Colorado River water flows through the canal to the Imperial and Coachella valleys. Irrigated since the early 1900s, this land, once an arid desert, now supplies fresh produce to the entire nation. Up north, the city of San Francisco was thriving, and by the 1920s, needed additional water supplies. They built a dam on the Tuolumne River in Yosemite National Park. This controversial project flooded the scenic Hetch Hetchy Valley. Water from this reservoir flows through the Hetch Hetchy Aqueduct across the Central Valley to fill reservoirs in the Bay Area. East Bay cities also went outside their area for water supplies and built a reservoir on the McCullumne River. The McCullumne Aqueduct runs from the reservoir through the Central Valley and the southern Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Many water projects were built because of groundwater overdraft. Hidden beneath the earth are areas where water collects, filling in the spaces between particles of soil and rocks. Since the 1800s, Californians have drilled wells to tap these groundwater aquifers scattered throughout the state. Rain, snowmelt, and streams replace what is pumped out. But there are areas where water is pumped out faster than it can be replaced by nature's cycle. This results in overdraft. The level of groundwater sinks out of reach of the pumps. One of the most dramatic effects of overdraft is subsidence. The sediment layer compresses and the surface of the land drops. Overdraft began occurring in the 1920s and 30s and continues in some areas today. Cities and farms rely on water from their groundwater basins. As the basins are depleted, they need to import water from distant areas. Before the 1920s, water development planning was usually done by local groups to solve local problems. As California grew, it became apparent that water development planning needed to be done on a statewide basis. Most of the rich agricultural land is located in the Central Valley. 2/3 of the people live in the comfortable but dry southern part of the state and the San Francisco Bay Area, while 2/3 of California's water supply is in the northern part of the state. Average precipitation across the state ranges from more than 80 inches a year to less than 5. Much of the water from the Cascades and Sierras drains into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Rain and snow are seasonal, drenching California in winter and spring, leaving it dry and parched in summer. These seasonal fluctuations, combined with cycles of drought or unusual wetness, make it difficult for California to have a water supply it can depend on all year, every year. In the early 1930s, the California Division of Water Resources developed a state water plan. The plan proposed building reservoirs to capture and store water for year-round use in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. It was known as the Central Valley Project. But due to the Depression in the 30s, the state couldn't sell bonds to build the project. So the Federal Bureau of Reclamation built and operates the Central Valley Project. It supplies water to farms in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys and cities in the Bay Area. The Central Valley Project is a series of dams, reservoirs, canals, and pumping and power plants. Like most water projects in California, it's designed to capture excess water from winter's rain and snow, store it, then move it when and where it's needed. By 1960, California's population was over 15 million. Recognizing the growing need for water, the California legislature and the voters approved construction of the California State Water Project, to be built and operated by the California Department of Water Resources. This 600-mile-long project is one of the biggest water development programs ever attempted. It stores water in Lake Oroville on the Feather River and distributes it to farms and cities in the Feather River area. Water is also delivered to the San Francisco Bay Area, the San Joaquin Valley, and Southern California. In addition to supplying water, the State Water Project also provides flood control, generates power, replenishes groundwater, and creates opportunities for recreation. As the 1960s came to an end, the era of intensive dam and aqueduct building was slowing down. California's rapid population growth had, for the moment, slowed as well. Strong concerns were being raised about the effect of California's growth on the environment. In response, state and federal protective laws and regulations were enacted. They established a wild and scenic river system to maintain the natural beauty and ecology of many of the state's watersheds. Wetlands, once plowed under or filled in by agriculture and urbanization, are being restored and preserved so they benefit plants, birds, fish, and wildlife. Much environmental concern involves the fragile Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, the most important estuary on the West Coast. Connected to the San Francisco Bay, the Delta is a network of freshwater streams, saltwater channels, and fertile islands. Water for 2/3 of California's people is sent through the Delta. Reservoirs in Northern California release water to flow into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The water is pumped out of the Delta by State Water Project and Central Valley Project facilities. It's sent to water banks for storage at San Luis Reservoir, the proposed Los Banos Grandes Reservoir, and underground in the Kern Water Bank. As it's needed, the water is released to local water agencies. Pumping water from the Delta changes the natural flow patterns in many Delta channels. During dry periods, it can pull salt water into fresh waterways, adversely affecting water quality and fish. To help overcome these problems, additional Delta pumps will be used in winter, pumping when water flows are highest and the fisheries less impacted. The Suisun Marsh near the Delta is one of the largest brackish wetlands in the United States. To protect and restore this area, the Department of Water Resources has installed salinity control gates. These gates regulate the levels of salt water in the marsh. Years ago, it was assumed that water facilities could be developed indefinitely. But environmental concerns and increased construction costs have changed that assumption. We need to use the water we have as efficiently as possible. One method, water conservation. At home, we can use low-flow shower heads, low-flush toilets, wash with less water, and plant landscapes which don't need as much water. Businesses and industries can save water too by planting water-efficient landscaping and reusing water. Agriculture can also conserve water by using a variety of techniques: drip irrigation and CIMIS, the California Irrigation Management Information System, which estimates the amount of water used by plants each day. These estimates help farmers irrigate without wasting water. Another way to conserve water is to reuse it. Reclaimed municipal wastewater now irrigates landscapes, golf courses, crops, and is used in industrial cooling. Stretching out existing water supplies so they are used efficiently can be done by agreements between water agencies. Such agreements helped supply water to the Santa Barbara area during the 1991 drought. Another technique for using water efficiently also emerged during 1991: water marketing. It worked like this. Some growers agreed to take certain land out of production. The state bought the water that the farmers saved and sold it to cities and growers who needed it. There are other innovative methods for improving our water situation. We can actually add to state water supplies by cloud seeding when conditions are right, resulting in increased snow. Turning to the ocean as a source of drinking water, desalination, may be cost-effective for cities along the coast. In 1991, a new municipal desalination plant began operating on Catalina Island. We know that we have to manage our water resources more wisely than ever. The state's water planners must balance population growth with protecting and improving habitat of fish and wildlife. What lies ahead in the California water story? This story really doesn't have an ending. It changes as California changes. From humble beginnings to sophisticated delivery systems. We may never solve all our water problems, but we will always strive to make them manageable.
So, with that, I apologize if that DVD, it looked a little washed out in a few spots, and I apologize for that. It is something that, again, I wanted to kind of give some background for those of you that may not know that we are in a very special situation here in California. Again, we have periods where we don't get very much rain, and then we have other periods where we can get torrential rains here because of El Niños and because of the way weather patterns start up and affect us here. And because of that, it's important to know why certain water projects have been developed and everything, because of our situation where population is below Sacramento. 80% of the water use of the state of California happens below Sacramento, but 70% of the rainfall happens north of Sacramento. And so we're in a very unique situation where we had to have water projects. If we wouldn't have, California would have been a much different place. I would personally have liked to have lived here. If it hadn't happened, it would have been a lot less crowded. But at any rate, for those of you who have them, before I go too much further, I've included a handout for you tonight. And it's basically just got a lot of informational stuff in there. A couple of things I wanted to point out is, again, Vista del Lago is a water education center, and that's where I work. If you know anybody that might have a group of kids, school-age kids, or even college-age adult groups that would like to come up there, we do conduct tours. We just would ask that you give us a call. Some of the other handouts in here have to do with Metropolitan's water resources, and then also the different California water projects other than the state water project. So, one of the things I also have in your handout, and I'd like to read it to you now, because it does explain a few things. The Department of Water Resources mission statement is to manage the water resources of California in cooperation with other agencies to benefit the state's people and protect, restore, and enhance the natural and human environments. The reason why I like to point that out is because we're going to have some rain events coming up, and I've heard it in the past, and I'm sure some of you have heard it, that we have these large flows of water that just rush out to the ocean. And there's certain situations that happen a little to the south of us in Los Angeles and further down south. But I'm specifically talking about the northern rivers and things along that come out, and water just travels right on out to the ocean. It would be nice to capture a lot of that. I think personally we could probably capture some more of it. But again, part of our mission, part of the reason why we were initially allowed to build the State Water Project was because we were going to try to enhance the natural environment as well as human environment. In other words, where we can go and appreciate that. So we have to allow a certain amount of water to flow through the natural water courses for the fish, the wildlife, a deer, other things like that, for hunters, fishermen, for people that just like to get out and see it. So that's one thing that's never going to stop, at least not with the State Water Project, and until certain things change. There's always going to be a certain amount of water that isn't captured. It does just flow out to the ocean. However, with that being said, I'd like to point out that with the City of Los Angeles, we have what they call the LA River, and since its humble beginnings as the water source for the Puebla de Los Angeles, back when Mr. Mulholland was a ditch cleaner, a zanjera, excuse me, my Spanish isn't the best. But when he started, they were drawing water from the Los Angeles River to feed the city of Los Angeles. And again, it was just a little Puebla then. Had ditches running through, and that was one of their jobs. However, as most of us know, there's no water that makes it quite that far anymore unless it's a very rainy season, and we're getting a lot of very big rain event at the time. So what's happened is when they cement line that, and I can tell you from experience with the City of LA in wastewater collection, the design of storm drains is to do one thing. It's to take water from one point and get it out of here as quick as possible. And out of here is to its final destination, and that is the ocean. And so with that being in mind, in the past, that was the idea. You didn't want water standing in the streets. You didn't want it to cause flooding or anything like that, so you had to get some sort of drainage together, a drainage system, and that's what the design purpose is for. Now, since then, I have heard that they are trying to slow it down and recapture it a bit down by Forest Lawn and everything. In other words, a little retention basin. Hopefully it'll percolate some into the ground, and potentially that's a source of water that isn't tapped here in the state of California. But we do have a problem in that, especially here in Southern California, where we need the resource and where every community draws upon groundwater at least in some percentage for their water resources for their community. We're paved over. If you think about it, water falls, it falls on the roof of your home, your business, it goes into a roof drain and goes into a street drain and out to the ocean. Parking lots are paved, the streets are paved. So we have very few places anymore where groundwater can accumulate, where we can keep surface water on the ground to let it percolate into the ground and replenish our groundwater supply. So again, that's another problem. People have asked me, well, couldn't we build pipelines and, from other Canada, from Oregon, from back east? Back east, they're having all kinds of huge rainfall events. And could it be done? I believe it could be. Personally, I look at some of the footage from the DVD I just showed you. If they could do it, why not us as well? We have the technology where we could probably even do it an easier way than they could. It's not the building of it that's the problem. It's ultimately, how do you get people to agree upon it? And the politicians and the bureaucrats and everything that would have to come hand to hand and come to a common conclusion as to that it is the best thing to do, and the way to do it is the best way that we're proposing and all that sort of thing. So to me, one of the things that needs to change most is people's attitude about water here in California. We have a very large agricultural segment in the Central Valley. We have 3 of the biggest agricultural producing counties in the United States right here in California. As a matter of fact, they're the top 3. It's Kings and Fresno, and I'm drawing a blank on the other one right now, but they're using water, and they're using the state's water resource, in other words, to grow some of their crops. However, I'm sure some of you have heard that we have certain crops such as almonds, pistachios, the nut crops like that use quite a bit of water. And it comes down to where they don't really give us a financial benefit from the sale of those almonds and nuts outside of California. And so we're using a great deal of our resource in order to feed these types of companies and these types of agricultural conglomerates that come out in the Central Valley. Getting back to water in general, the film also mentioned the Central Valley Project. I'd like to speak to that for just one quick second. Prior to the Central Valley Project being developed, again, we've had a cyclical rain thing going on here in California for hundreds of years. Some experts believe that maybe even as long as decades, 20 and 30, 40, 50-year spells with no rain or no significant rainfall has occurred in the past here. Of course, most of you probably realize that records have only been being kept a little over 100 years, though. So we don't have firm records, but the scientists do say they can see that in the rocks, different vegetation, things like that going back, the trunks of trees and that sort of thing. But the Central Valley Project was primarily twofold, the reason why it was built. One was to stop the flooding that was occurring when we'd have these heavy rainfall years. It was literally washing away great topsoil, washing away towns and communities sometimes, and people were dying from it. Roads, bridges, anything man-made built. Until the project went in, we were at the mercy of the floods. Also, the second part of that equation was during the drought years, if the Central Valley Project was built, and I'm talking about the primary reservoirs of Sacramento, as well as Trinity and American, Stanislaus, the New Melonious Dam and River, I should say, on the Stanislaus. Those reservoirs, if you will, provided water during these dry times, and so the agriculture could blossom and could produce here in the state, and it did. It helped the state really bloom, because before the control of the water, again, people lived, like they said in the film, near water sources. This way we could have water directed out towards land that didn't necessarily have a water source, but it was good for growing crops if they did get water. And so it did help quite a bit with financial futures of California and the agricultural industry in general. That was back in the 30s. Back in 1957, the original plan to build the State Water Project came along, and I gave you a handout regarding our mission statement on one side and the history on the other, and I thought that was interesting. That's why it's included. Is it actually gives credit for Mr. Edmonston, whom I'm sure if any of you know of the system that we're talking about, the Edmonston pumping plant's just up the 5 freeway, and it pumps water from the Central Valley up and over the Tehachapi's. It is the highest single lift in the world, accomplished in one lift. It's 1,926 feet, and the Edmonston pumping plant was named after Arthur David Edmonston, who is given credit for proposing the idea to Governor Brown at the time, Edmund Brown, our current governor's father. With that, I'd like to kind of start talking a little bit about the State Water Project. So what is the State Water Project? Well, it's basically a series of pipelines, canals, natural water courses, and reservoirs that bring water over 600 miles from Northern California to its furthest stretches, again, are Lake Paris in the south, and then also towards Beaumont and Shirley Valley out toward the southeast. And with that, if you would start the second film for me, I would appreciate it.